Hey guys, I am David Miller. I am a Phoenix, Arizona multimedia artist, and I have a studio, Primordial Creative, in Tempe, Arizona, where we do photography, animation, videography, a bunch of other fun stuff. This class is going to focus on art photography, and that is where most of my background and education lie. So art photography is a huge umbrella. It means a lot of things to a lot of people. I am just going to simply define it as photography that is either based in conceptualism, which means you have an idea and you try and execute it, or self-expression, which means you are responding to something that is in front of you, something from your own life. So there's a lot of art photography that didn't start out as art photography. Things that are historical, even if it had a commercial purpose, like these old portraits, time has turned that into art photography. So you can go in a museum and see on the walls things that were never intended as pieces of art, but have become pieces of art because time and history has defined them as such. There's a lot of fashion photography that overlaps with the art world. So you might go into a bookstore and look at a fashion magazine and they're trying to sell you the purse, the shoes, the clothes, etc. But there is such a level of creativity in there, there's such a level of conceptual care that it just as easily could be an art piece as much as it is a commercial piece. We're going to explore a lot of avenues as it relates to art photography in this class. We are going to spend a lot of time not talking about gear, but talking about concepts, about setting up shoots, and I'm even going to have a few lessons that show you the behind the scenes of some of my own art photography shoots and how I edited those photos. So I feel like you're going to get a lot out of this class. I went to college for this stuff, and these were the kinds of things that were most valuable to me as I tried to grow my own artistic vision and as I tried to figure out what avenues are available to me as an art photographer. What you're going to need for this class is a camera and hopefully some editing software. I recommend Adobe's photo package, which is Lightroom and Photoshop. Certainly there are other forms of editing software out there. I don't feel like they are as useful as Lightroom or Photoshop, which are pretty industry standard. You're also going to need subject material, and this is going to be totally up to you. A lot of what I present to you is going to be people and portrait focused. So if you have an available compliant subject, that is a good place to start. But if you prefer to do landscapes or animals, that's fine as well. There's going to be things that are of value to you in this class. Let's begin. The first step in developing a personal vision, I feel, is having heroes and having role models that also have their own vision. Because when you can identify somebody by name and you can identify their style, you can sort of piece together how they approached a problem, how they creatively problem solved, how they functioned in their own life, what role art had in their life, how often they wrote songs or made movies, and how they functioned within their own family structures and their own personal relationships. The first guy who got me really excited about photography, his name is Sebastião Salgado, and he's very well known. His work hangs in the United Nations. I saw his work in 1997 in a museum in Omaha, Nebraska, my hometown. And it was pictures of migrants and workers. They were shot black and white, presented really starkly. I recognized some of those visuals from a Smashing Pumpkins video that had heavily borrowed from his work called Bullet with Butterfly Wings. Salgado is a humanist. He is an economist from Brazil. And he spends many years and a lot of money gathering the images he needs to tell these very serious, very epic stories of workers, of migrants. And in his most recent project, Genesis, he traveled to all these primordial locations around the earth, the Galapagos Islands, the areas where the world's oldest trees are,
where the humans first did cave paintings, and the scale that Salgado works on is probably beyond what most of us could achieve, certainly what I can achieve at this age. I personally don't have the serious mindset that one needs to be laser focused the way that Salgado is, but there are many other traits I've borrowed from him. His particular style of black and white, it's very graphic design oriented and very heavy blacks. The scenarios that the people are in are very real world and gritty, and I feel like I've borrowed a lot of that, even though my own personal work is a little more fashion and portrait oriented. I love watching interviews with these heroes because there are many times when I'm down on my own artwork and I'm gonna head over to YouTube and I'm gonna look up one of those guys and I'm gonna watch a YouTube interview with them and walk away feeling like completely refreshed and reinvigorated, and realize a lot of times in those interviews you find that your heroes have creative problems they've run up against, obstacles, they've run out of money, they've broken all their gear, they have no ideas, and a lot of times you watch these interviews and it helps you get over the hump the way that they did in their lives. Today we're going to talk about things that are all about you as a person. One is figuring out what it is you have to say, and number two is figuring out what you have access to. These two factors are completely together. You can have very strong opinions and interest about things on the other side of the earth, but if you don't have regular access to them, you will not have anything really of value to say about them. At the same time, I have access to many things like my own backyard, like alleyways, like local neighborhood stuff, but if I don't have a strong opinion about it, then there's no depth to that artwork. So these things work together. So first I'm going to show you one of my own series. I worked on this from about 2007 through 2009, and occasionally I still add to this series, but it is my series Animal Sight. Ever since I was a teenager, I was a huge animal lover. I became a vegetarian. I've gone through periods of veganism in my life. I've supported animal rights causes, and I grew up in Nebraska, which is a place that does not have a strong animal rights community. One of the things that is common in Nebraska is being told that these creatures are ours to do with as we please. They were put here on earth by God for us to consume and to rule over. And I just did not believe that in my heart as a teenager. So when I worked on this series, I decided I was going to focus on animal eyes because eyes are considered the window to the soul, and I genuinely believe that if souls exist in human beings, they also exist in other life forms. I focused on domesticated animals and zoo animals to start with because these are the things that I had easy access to. I started going to a lot of county fairs and finding livestock, and as my series grew, I challenged myself to expand into reptiles, to insects, to avians, all kinds of other animals. And when other people saw me working on this series, all of a sudden a lot of doors opened up and I had access to exotic animals that were owned by private owners. And the more that I continued this series, the more I challenged myself to showcase it in different ways. For example, there is a photographic effect that most people are familiar with called red eye, and this happens when the on-camera flash bounces off the reflective surface of our eye and back into the lens, causing a red glow in a human being's eye. So I used this effect on a lot of different animals, and I found that it actually enhanced the imagery and the idea that these weren't just soulless robots walking around made of meat, but that they had some kind of wild energy inside them. And these are some of my favorite images. They're also some of the most personal to me because this is something that I spent many years working on, and I really have a strong opinion about it even today. There's a lot of work I've made in my life that I don't have strong opinions on, and I look at it, and today it feels like it was made by a different human being. Certainly there's topics that I have no opinions on whatsoever, like sports, and I would fit into society a lot better if I did have an opinion about sports, but unfortunately I don't. And so I don't even have the drive to pursue the topic, much less find access to
the inner workings of a sports team or a sports location. So these are the things we need to ask ourselves. What do we have to say, and what do we have access to? Okay, we are continuing our series on how to find your photographic voice. And this one is all about experimentation. Now, this flies in the face of a lot of advice that young photographers are being given, and I've met many of these people in real life where they think they need to select a particular style and they need to stick to it, and that is how you build a following, that is how you build a brand. I'm here to tell you, as an artist for 20 years, that this may work if you are trying to build a business, but if you are just starting out, number one, you don't know what your brand identity is, or you don't know what you can do yet. You don't know what you don't know. This is a fact. Number two, you won't get any better if you don't experiment and you don't change. What will happen in the best of scenarios is you will have an early hit, and then you will continue to make variations of those early hits. And in fact, when you are just starting out, you don't even know what a hit is, because a successful image to somebody who's just starting out may seem like something that pleases them and nobody else. It may be something you put on social media and got a lot of likes. So I want to talk to you about some very famous creatives throughout the 20th century. I'm going to talk to you about Pablo Picasso, the Beatles, Elvis Presley. I want to talk to you about Steven Spielberg, or pretty much anybody famous you could name in any creative field. Queen, U2, Led Zeppelin, Pink Floyd, Peter Jackson, Andy Warhol. These are artists who changed a lot, and they rarely set out to repeat themselves. Now, today, we will think of something like the Beatles or Steven Spielberg, and we will say, oh, I recognize those elements of their creativity. I recognize Steven Spielberg has particular type of cinematography that he uses and particular kind of music that he uses. And while that is sometimes true, sometimes it is not, I dare you to compare Schindler's List to E.T., to Jaws, to Munich, and say that those are the same movie, that they are the same exact brand, when in fact they are clearly not. They are vastly different. And I highlight those, alongside many of his other films, of course, as peaks of his career. You could also say Jurassic Park, Raiders of the Lost Ark, so on and so forth. Because Steven is challenging himself every single time he sets out to make a movie, and he's not satisfied. The same with the Beatles. If you go through their most creative period, so we're talking Rubber Soul forward, essentially, every album is different. Paul McCartney has gone on record saying around the time of Revolver, they were looking for different drum sounds for every single song because they could not reuse the same sound. It would have been a creative cop-out to them. And by the time they did Sgt. Pepper's, it was including a lot more wild instrumentation, the Indian musicians, the 1920s type music, a lot of horns. By the time they did the White Album, it was sprawling chaos, one of my favorites. And you might say to yourself, well, that works for the Beatles, but I know there are examples of artists who are known only for one thing, and that got them their career. And I will say to you that they found their peak. If they were true artists, they found their peak through experimentation. So at this point, we have to ask, what does being experimental with your photographic vision mean? Well, one advantage photography has over other art forms is that it's much easier to work in a series. So if a painter wants to work in a series on the topic of old farmhouses, to pick one from my youth because I'm originally from the Midwest, that painter might spend years painting variations of these old farmhouses. And certainly a lot of creative series take years, and the things that we know, like Vincent van Gogh took years to make. But with photography, it might take days, it might take hours, it might take weeks, but it doesn't have to take years to complete a photo series. So my challenge to you if you were to do a photographic series on these old barns, I'm sure, like most people, the beginning approach would be a very traditional one. You would drive out, you would photograph the old barn, maybe outside, maybe inside. Maybe it's during some cool weather, so you've got a storm brewing in the distance. But these are where we start with our old barn series. And then the next time you go out to the old barn, maybe you bring along an individual with you. You bring another person. And that other person is going to be included in your barn photos. So maybe they are like the Andrew Wyeth painting. Maybe they are on the other side of some broken wood and you see only elements of the person, so it's really mysterious. Maybe they're a blur. You know, maybe they're just some motion that happens to be going around the barn. Maybe they are kind of FSA 1930s photography style person posted up against the barn portraits. But this is the way that you build on your original concept. Now maybe the next time you go and photograph the barn, you've looked at your earlier stuff and you think it's very traditional. It definitely follows in the vein of something else you've seen in the case of the Andrew Wyeth painting or the FSA photography. So you say, this time I'm going to do the barn a little bit differently. I've been shooting it digital, maybe I'll take some infrared film out, or maybe I'll take some instant film out. I'll do instant film portraits around the old barn. Or maybe I'll keep shooting it digital, but instead of single images, I'm going to try and do some panoramic stuff, which I can stitch together in Photoshop or Lightroom. So we're building on the technique as well as the concept. And as you work through a series, you might find a groove that works really well for you. But unless you get out and change it up every single time, you are not going to find that groove. You're going to pick the easiest, the laziest route, and you're going to continue down that path. And I guarantee that whatever the easiest, laziest route is in any photographic subject material, that road is well paved by thousands of other people who came before you. If you were looking to get this work published, if you were looking to get this work exhibited, if you were looking for some kind of satisfaction out of this work, just personal satisfaction, it won't happen by taking the easiest, laziest route. So I encourage you and I implore you to experiment every time you do a shoot, whether it's building onto a series or whether it is just something that you're going to do this Sunday, even if it's pictures of your family. There are things that you can do that are going to be new and different and fresh to you as a photographer, as long as you keep an open mind and a willingness to experiment. So we're continuing our series on finding your photographic vision, and this one will be about choosing your critics. Because the truth is, we are very poor judges of our own work. Many people do not feel like they know themselves completely, and they cannot see the complete picture of what they're making because they're so deep into the process of making what they're making. So a critic does not have to be somebody who is going to put you down or make you feel bad about what you're making. A critic is somebody who knows what questions to ask that propel you further down a creative path. In choosing our critics, we should know the name of the person, we should know their background, we should know their interests, and anything else that's pertinent artistic information. I'm saying this because more often than not, young artists and young photographers don't choose their critics. They put something up on social media and then they are affected by how many people like it or don't like it, or which particular person likes it, whether or not they know anything about that person. I have been victim to this myself. I have put up a photo that I was extraordinarily proud of, and maybe it didn't communicate with other people. Possibly it was the wrong time of day or the wrong day of the week, but for whatever reason it didn't garner the same amount of likes that something else might have that I wasn't as proud of. This is not something that should be affecting me mentally or creatively, because there are too many elements that are out of my control in social media. The least of which is that a lot of social media has an algorithm to it that looks at the composition of a photo or who's in it, who's tagged. And these things don't really reflect on the quality of the single image, nor does it reflect on the quality of an entire series that that image may be part of. There's a publisher of a well-known photography magazine who has an incredibly gifted artistic insight into why people make what they make. And it isn't so much about the content of the photographs, it's just the artistic creative process that he is so insightful to. So when I sat down with this gentleman, it was a total joy to just talk about what the work could be. This magazine publisher had insight into a variety of genres, but more importantly, he knew how to assemble images into a cohesive unit that told a story or communicated a concept larger than each of their individual pieces. And that was the feedback that I was looking for, because up until that point, I have been what essentially is a greatest hits photographer, meaning I do a shoot, I look for the single best image, I work it up, and that image might not correspond to anything else I've ever shot before. So you might say to yourself, well, that's a kind of a good way to do things. Isn't that how painters and illustrators do things? And that is true. That's how a painter might work. They might just have a single strong visual concept that they execute in a painting, but I guarantee almost anybody famous you've ever heard of works in sequences or series, so there are multiple images that combine to form a larger gestalt concept. So that's the kind of feedback that I was looking for my photographs, and this magazine publisher was able to give me that feedback because he's an editor, and almost all magazine editors, whether it's Time Magazine, Life, National Geographic, Art Photography, they're looking for ways to fit these images to tell a greater story together. You are much better served if you find a well-informed mentor or critic who has an interest in the kind of stuff you're doing and will help you answer those questions that you are unable to answer yourself. Now, in this final lesson, I want to talk about dedication and human behavior. And it doesn't really matter if you're a photographer or a painter, illustrator, actor, anything that you do that's creative, you need to show up for work every day. And this includes if you have an 8-hour job that has nothing to do with photography or anything else. At some point, you need to devote a portion of your brain to your creative passion, because if you don't, you're giving yourself an excuse to put it off, and if you start giving yourself excuses, it doesn't end. Every single day, you can do one of these things. You can organize your photos, you can plan a shoot, you can plan a trip, you can learn something through a tutorial such as this. You can edit old photos. You can blog about your work. You can say something about it and let people know that it's more than just a visual representation. You can seek out a gallery or exhibition space or a magazine that might be interested in your photography. You can look at the work of other people that you admire. You can look at things that aren't photography, like movies and music, and pull inspiration from them. Every day, though, you gotta feed that monkey. And believe me when I say you take a week off, it is going to set you back more than a week. It's gonna set you back a month or 2 months or maybe even a year. So showing up to work every day creatively, that is super, super important. So now beyond showing up for your creativity every day, you also need to finish everything you start. And again, there's a part of a human personality that says, this is uncomfortable, I'm tired, I'm bored, I don't want to finish this, I don't want to work on this. But I'm here to tell you, you have to. People won't believe in you if you don't finish what you start. You won't believe in yourself if you don't finish what you start. So we're going to talk about the compelling concept, and I feel like this is an area that is a struggle for a lot of people, but I'm going to try and break it down in a way that's very simple. As art photographers,
We have an obligation to think about our art and not just assume our daily lives are the perfect creative fodder. If it were that way, we'd have more songs about folding laundry, people going to the bathroom all the time in movies, more TV shows about pumping gas and answering emails. The bitter truth is the daily lives of most people are not that interesting. It's when we have an opinion or an exploratory curiosity that we, the artists, have a point of view. And that point of view is what generates content and leads to the proper format for that content. What do you have a point of view about? This is what you should be making your art about. Is it something social, personal, or political? What makes you excited in either a positive or negative way about a particular subject? That's what you should be shooting and presenting to the public. Ansel Adams was passionate about natural landscapes and their preservation, so he delved deep and worked thankless years to create what is widely considered iconic imagery. Ralph Eugene Meatyard, again, one of my favorite guys, had an interest in Zen philosophy and a working knowledge of optical illusions thanks to his employment as an optician, both of which were expressed in his photography. Often it's not easy for us to understand what we have a point of view of in our normal lives, much less our artistic lives. Most people have a few political opinions, not necessarily good subject matter for photography, which is a visual medium, and they also have hobbies. We have jobs that may lend themselves to photography. When I took up art photography in 1997, I was working in group homes and did portraits of the developmentally disabled clients with their guardians' consent. These were people I liked, and they liked me, and we knew each other personally. They were part of a subculture and experience not typically seen by the average American. I had unique access and a point of view, and though my shooting skills weren't that great, I could still look at that work and feel connected to it, and feel like it has a reason for being. Fast forward to my early years in Arizona, where I made a bunch of trips to national parks and shot scenery. Although those experiences were great, I had no point of view, no insider access to a subject that millions of people experience each year. I will never forget the time I was challenged about the shallowness of my work. So let's start with number one, your subject. Once during my brief tenure as a high school photography teacher, I had an exceptional student who told me she wanted to focus her senior project on homeless people. Through questioning, we determined that she didn't know any homeless people, didn't have time to volunteer at a shelter and make connections, and probably wouldn't feel safe engaging with the population beyond a surface level. Also, we were in the suburbs, and the majority of homeless were deep in Phoenix. It was hard to do a project that you know nothing about and can't access what's required for it. We usually start with our circle of friends and family and work outwards, and rightly so. Many artistic portraiture photographers made their names by working within their own tight social circle. Sally Mann and Ralph Eugene Meatyard made art out of the lives of their families. Cindy Sherman and Bob Carey make art out of themselves. Sang Quan Chi did self-portraits in front of monuments. When we have total access to subjects, the when, where, and do I owe you anything kind of questions are irrelevant. The next level of this social circle is people who know people. My daughter wants to be a model. Will you take her photo? My neighbor is an autistic accordion-playing comedian, is one I recently heard that intrigued me. These people are good for practice, but sight unseen, it's hard to make art based on blind recommendations. You never know if your artistic intentions align with your subjects, and all of a sudden you may owe images or try to satisfy this stranger as if they are a customer. Other strangers have some level of talent or investment in your project are models, actors, and actresses. Their interest may be in need for portfolio images, financial compensation you offer them. Their interest may be a need for portfolio images, financial compensation you might offer them, or appreciation of you as an artist and willingness to be part of your project. I've found more consistent results in my art with this level of person, mainly because they are more familiar with what I do, and I'm familiar with what they can bring to a shoot, all in advance. The last level of finding your subjects is through random happenstance. You see someone on the street doing something interesting, you photograph them right away, or you ask permission in the kindest way possible, such as, "What you're doing is really interesting, mind if I take a photo?" If you're nice and genuine, you'll get an affirmative answer, but unless you can prove you work for National Geographic, don't expect random people to be willing in any way to sign a model release for you. In America, people in public places can be photographed for personal or editorial use, and unless it's work for hire or some other specific contractual obligation, the photographer is the owner of the image. However, you can't expect people in the public to know any of this or not threaten to sue you or beat you up if they think you're spying on them with your camera. Add into this the variety of new municipality laws regarding privacy that confuse the issue, and the random circumstances surround how good your results may be for street photography, and it's a difficult row to hoe if your preferred method of getting subjects is randomly walking up to people on the street. Along with formal considerations are our technical considerations. This is your camera and lens setup and extends to any printing methodology tied into the capture. It may be your phone, it could be analog film, a Lomo lo-fi plastic thingy, a modern DSLR or mirrorless digital camera. It could be something that isn't actually a camera, like an alternative print process or a plain old scanner. It could utilize instant film or disposable cameras or antique methods like daguerreotypes. Each method of capture brings with it its expectations and handicaps, a particular vibe that affects the entire image. For example, old-timey portrait methods used today require subjects to stay still because they have slow shutter speeds and slow exposure methods. Since I like surrealism in my imagery, using less traditional means of image capture adds surrealism without me having to introduce it in post via Photoshop. Lens choice has a profound effect on how a subject is presented in an image. Wide-angle lenses, when shot close to a subject, evoke cartoonish energy and distortion. If the goal is a beauty shot, the close and wide look isn't very ideal. Wide angle pulled back won't distort the subject, but it firmly plants them in the environment, creating the cinematic look that movies do for establishing shots. Though the wide angle lens creates unflattering looks, some of those can be ironed out using Adobe Lightroom's transform function. The kind of lenses most commonly associated with portrait photography on SLRs and DSLRs are the 50mm and the 85mm lenses with large apertures that allow for a blurred background, reducing everything beyond our subject to graphic shapes. The focal lengths also force the photographers to position themselves in the ideal length of space from a subject, not too far away and not too close. Now we are going to talk about styling. This is a catch-all term for hair, makeup, wardrobe, or lack thereof, and props for a shoot. The street photographer doesn't need to think about styling because they are working with what naturally appears in front of them as subject matter. A commercial photographer styles from top to bottom because everything in the shoot has to be 100% intentional. Styling was one of the most difficult things for me to get down in my own portrait photography. I'll work with stylists and send them inspirational imagery or mood boards, but there's no guarantee that they know how to achieve that particular look, or if the model we are using has the right hair size for whatever is available. The styling crew are the people who get the least out of any photos you take, so this is likely where some money is going to be spent. Because I like a particular amount of production in my images, a hairstylist is a top priority for a shoot. People generally cannot do their own hair as well as an actual stylist can, who has 360-degree access to the subject's head. Makeup is something most men do not need for their creative portraiture, and the majority of women I've worked with can do what I refer to as going out on a date makeup, stuff that looks great in real life but doesn't communicate well in a photo. An actual makeup artist can do on-camera makeup with astronomically expensive supplies, and it'll actually show up in the images. Makeup artists are generally more costly than hairstylists, and if you have both hair and makeup on set, you're easily adding an extra hour or 2 or 3 to the shoot time. It's a frustrating scenario to have a studio and models booked for 4 hours, and hair and makeup eats up the majority of that time while the photographer just stands around. Beyond makeup is FX. Body paint, gore, fake scars, adding jewelry, making people look frozen or cartoony. The more specific the look, the more it covers and the longer it takes to do. The body paint shoots I've worked with have ranged from 1 hour, a chaotic mess which still look cool, to 6 hours, elaborate designs involving words. Each time I work with an FX artist, I leave thinking it was worth it, but the process of getting it done is quite tiresome for all involved. I don't have too many words for wardrobe and prop styling, but one can see how budgets could spiral based on the styling alone. It's said that setting a movie as a period piece makes the costs skyrocket in such a way that Hollywood does its best to avoid them. If you do choose to create something that is period specific and requires styling, then there should be a lot of extra research to make sure everything fits the way it's supposed to. A few years ago, I came across a fashion shoot on the internet. It was supposed to be based on D-Day, and they had a bikini model among a platoon of soldiers who were all holding modern weapons but dressed in the 1940s GI outfits. Needless to say, that shoot did not work. A final word about styling. There are a lot of people who go for a very minimalist style of photography and don't have overly complicated concepts, overly complicated hair and makeup and wardrobe. And typically, the more generic you shoot, the more likely you can utilize those photos in a variety of applications. I adore the people I work with who can do their own styling because it saves so much time and money. I also adore my stylists who I can communicate well with, or should I say, understand my feeble attempts to describe styling. Those people are the ones I use over and over and over again. If you ignore styling completely, then it's hard to have a strong concept in our art. If we were painters, we could send signals from our imagination to our hands and put exactly what we intended together in a way that satisfies the concept. In the real world, concepts need to be physically built by talented hands. Now we have to talk about formal design considerations. All art education usually starts with exploring the elements of art: texture, form, space, shape, color, value, and line. And then you also learn the principles of design: unity, scale, pattern or rhythm, balance, hierarchy or dominance, and perspective. An artist or designer draws from these ideas in any visual composition, so photography naturally makes good use of this. I don't necessarily think about these tools night and day and design shoots around them, but I'm experienced enough that I use them all the time. For instance, telling a family to keep colors to basic cool, warm, or earth tones, or shooting a shiny motorcycle amongst contrasting textures. My experience has been the average person will gauge a photo based on color over all the other elements. They may be drawn to colors that pop or colors that register emotion. People that love black and white images are heavily focused on having all the values represented. Appreciators of traditional fine art nudes are highly invested in shape and form. These are all important and can be seeds of good ideas, but the work really improves when the creator plays with all the tools. Cool shapes, proper use of positive and negative space, with an engaging rhythm, great value or color, believable textures, all in one image. The last point to cover in our formal and technical talk is post-production and in-camera effects. There are times when I love the computer and all the things it does to aid me creatively, and there are periods when I've spent so much time staring at the screen I want to scream. There are times when I want to make tactile art, get wet hands, use paint and drawing, burn, freeze, and otherwise engage in a physical process while working on photos. Mixed media has been a part of the photographic art since the first false color was painted on a black and white print, and it's everywhere today, from scrapbooking to the highest level of graphic design and fashion shooting. Bringing in other media can take otherwise ordinary shape and give it a layer of meta context, something real beyond reality. This involves altering a print physically, adding collage or drawing, embroidery, or allowing the forces of nature to take hold by freezing, burning, and otherwise grunging up the physical print. Some of the in-camera effects you can use to get a creative portrait effect is controlling time, so slow shutter speeds to get blurs, or multiple flashes during a slow shutter to get dragging the shutter effects. Dragging the shutter involves something around 1/15 of a second shutter speed while you pop a flash and there are ambient lights around. If you zoom your lens or move your camera around at the same time, you will get wild energy, which sometimes looks great and sometimes doesn't look so hot, but that is one method for getting a creative portrait shoot. You can change the light that comes through your lens. So filters are the most common way of changing that light, or holding up an object that distorts light, such as a glass in front of your lens. You can also bend the lens, and the way that you bend the lens is either free lensing, meaning the lens is not attached to your camera at the time you are moving it around, or to use something unique, such as a lens baby, which has a tilt-shift effect built into it. A lot of the lens babies that I'm aware of have a plastic lens attached to a rubberized hose body, and you manipulate this around to have one sweet spot of your lens in focus, and the rest of it goes very soft and zoomy.
Now in this section, I'm going to present to you a lot of behind-the-scenes footage from shoots that I have done, and I'm going to explain what's happening and even show you some of the conceptual sketches that happened before the shoot took place. I'm going to be doing a voiceover on this behind-the-scenes footage. I'm going to explain some of the challenges that took place when we did the shoots, but Besides your own personal first-hand experience doing shoots, I feel like watching what people do behind the scenes is of incredible value because you really find out what it's like to do a shoot when you don't have any skin in the game. What I mean is there is no pressure for you to perform or be in front of these people and have a result happen. And in fact, you'll see some of the mistakes I've made, and I'm going to address those. Feel free to learn from my mistakes. It's definitely easier than making the mistakes on your own. After that, I'm going to show you a little bit of editing I do in Lightroom and Photoshop as it relates to these model shoots. And I'll also describe my own personal thoughts on how much you should alter a photograph, because when we're making fine art pieces, it isn't quite the same as if you're doing something that's journalistic. And in journalism, you're not really allowed to alter photographs a lot. In fine art, it doesn't matter because you are trying to express your concept or your inner vision, but I'm going to address that when we do the editing section.
I'm going to tell you about a shoot I did with model Kyla Stone, and my stylist for this shoot was Lux Tango. To start from the beginning, I wanted to do something in the vein of some of the old 1960s driving action scenes. And I specifically mean James Bond or the Italian film Danger Diabolic. I find these to be a lot of fun. I think they have a unique effect to them, which you don't see in movies a lot nowadays, but back then it's called rear projection, where the driving footage is literally just projected behind your protagonist as they're driving and they're acting like they're actually in the scene. Even though modern movies would either have the driving for real or use green screen technology, I get a real kick out of this particular look, and I wanted to do a shoot based around it. I wanted to have an actual car chase where the same person is driving against themselves. So I'll have a good version of the person and a bad version of the person. And even though I mentioned these older films, a more recent example of inspiration is a TV show called Danger 5, which was inspired by the same exact sources that I mentioned before, James Bond and Danger Diabolic. So the model that I chose for this was Kyla Stone, and she is somebody I found on Instagram and also Model Mayhem. They're two good places to find models either locally or in another city if you're traveling to one. I knew that Kyla was moving to Asia very soon, and I had an opportunity to work with her right before she left. She was mostly a fashion model, but when I proposed the idea, she was totally down for it. And Lux Tango is somebody that has done modeling and hair and makeup and body paint and all sorts of things with me for 7 years. So I had my theme, I had my person, I had my styling, and the location. I happened to have a studio, so that wasn't a big deal. What I needed for the shoot was the background material and some props, because it's one thing to say you have a big idea, it's another thing to get all the parts together to make that idea work. So the background footage, I stuck my camera in the back seat of my car, and then I drove around on the freeway a little bit and just filmed that. That was my footage. I already owned the projector, and in my studio I planned on just projecting this against a big white screen. The props that I needed were a car seat, a steering wheel, and then other things to make it feel like we're actually in the car. I took the rearview mirror out of my own car. I put a call out on Facebook to get a vintage steering wheel, and it turns out my studio mate actually owned one, so that was an easy prop to get. For the car seat, my original idea was to just take the seat out of my own car and bring it in, but I realized this was easier said than done, so I used an office chair that was roughly the same shape as a car seat, and since I was going to have two cars race against each other, the idea was that the steering wheel and the car seat would be covered in the good girl scenario, and in the bad girl scenario, I just wouldn't use any coverings and just use plain old office chair as the background. While I was getting these car seat materials, I happened upon some skeleton gloves, and they didn't cost a whole lot. They struck me as being very visual, so I went ahead and picked them up. And that worked out to our benefit because when Kyla was the good girl, she ended up wearing the skeleton gloves, and when she was the bad girl, it was her bare knuckles, but the rest of her was covered. The bad girl dress was something that Lux Tango owned. The look for the bad girl was somewhat inspired by Billy Corgan from Smashing Pumpkins circa 1997. He used to dress very gothy, and that was our impetus for this particular look. The good girl look, however, was basically Kyla in regular makeup and hair, and then we happened to find a sweater around the studio. If we didn't have that, we would have used some like Goodwill sundress for the rest of our styling. To get the props in place, I had to use clamps to hold things so they were where they needed to be. For the back of the car, I just sliced cardboard in a particular shape, and then when we did a shot on the bad girl car, we reversed the cardboard so the curve was on the other edge. We filmed the good girl first because she had the least amount of makeup, spent about 30 more minutes in the makeup chair, and then had our bad girl scenario. I had written out a list of about 10 things that each of them could do, and really it was a list of 10 things the good girl could do, and then I just had the bad girl respond by throwing things around. Our final bit of the video required the bad girl to go off of a cliff, and because they're not in real cars, I decided to go for a more special effects route and have something where she spins into another reality and maybe I put fire around her. To do that, I had to shoot her against a green screen, and my green screen setup was incredibly small. It really only needed the upper torso and head and hands. I had to tell Kyla, this is your limited area, and she was totally cool with it, but we lit 2 lights on the background and 2 lights on Kyla. I had to take this into Adobe After Effects to drop out the green area and then put in spirally patterns behind her. The spiral patterns I got from a pad of paper that I picked up at Target, and this pad of paper happened to have a whole bunch of different patterns to it. I think I bought it clearance for $5, so my total investment besides paying the model and the stylist was the pad of paper, the car seat covers, and the skeleton gloves, and I think everything else in the shoot I was able to borrow or create myself. The final product of this was, of course, the video that I intended to make, but when you're shooting video and you shoot with a 4K camera, it's very easy to pull stills out. So I got a lot of great still images that I'm able to use as fashion or art portfolio pieces. And of course, I made time to shoot maybe 10 minutes each look for other still images. And altogether, I feel like this is one of the more successful shoots. I got a video, I got a lot of still images, I got more than one look out of it, and in these still images, I made use of gel lighting, which is where you put a colored gel in front of your lights and you're able to get really unique and strange effects. My thought process is these model shoots are not cheap, they take a lot of time and effort, and they have a lot of ideas to them, so you want to make sure that you're getting a whole bunch of material out of it. In case something goes wrong, you want to be able to say, at least I have the still images, at least I have the Instax shots, at least I have the 4K footage that I'm able to pull complete stills from.
I'm going to talk to you about a model shoot I did in Portland earlier in 2017. The model's name at the time was Mary Jane McLean, and I'm not sure if she still goes by that name anymore. I see she's changed it on Instagram. But we had the opportunity to shoot in a dive bar, and this dive bar was presented to me. This dive bar was offered as a location to me by a photographer named Ben Honeybee. He's a great guy. He's a bartender at this place. We knew each other through Instagram, so I've already worked with Mary Jane at this point, and knew her. Wasn't too far from where she lived, so when I picked her up and then drove over, it was maybe like a 3-minute drive. Got to the bar full of a bunch of weirdos. Found out there was a basement to this bar. Basement was really dirty and ratty, and it was super cool. At the time, I was into the South African Zeph rap group Diantwoord, I believe. I'm mispronouncing that name, but oh well. And they have an image that is really rough and dark, and a lot of this image comes from their work with photographer Roger Ballin. I thought this was super cool, and I had brought a spotlight with me, so when I shot with Mary Jane, It was mostly all dark, only lit with the spotlight, as if she were a creature living in the basement, a la Hugo on The Simpsons. And it was fun to shoot this, and I was playing the outward music. Afterward, some of the feedback I got on the shots were they were a bit too rough and scary, so that is not what I'm presenting to you guys here, but there is a lot of cool texture in a dive bar. Will I ever shoot in a dive bar again? I can't say. It's small, it's weird to be photographing when there's people that are drunk watching you, and it would have to be a particular type of model who would go like all in about the rough, grungy atmosphere. I don't feel like that's what happened when I shot with Mary Jane, but still, live and learn.
And I'm telling you stories about a shoot I did with Annie Montgomery. This is the only time I shot with Annie. She was recommended to me by my friend Glass Olive, and I guess they're really good buddies from back in the day. We shot in LA, Venice Beach, I believe, and the original idea was to have Annie be a living statue. I had just gone to Greece, and I love Greek culture, mythology, Greek art, but I had gone to a museum and saw a lot of Greek statues, so I contacted my hair and makeup team, Laura Buenrostro and Brittany Moody, and I said, let's do something like this, kind of statuey. And I talked to Annie. I had wanted her to be a living statue out on the Venice boardwalk. So I actually wanted her to be like standing there and not moving, and maybe make a video where she's totally still, but you see all the people zooming by. And that was a noble effort, but it wasn't gonna happen. And when I got to Annie's house, and she was already halfway done by Laura and Brittany, I looked around the place that she was staying. It was a guest house next to a pool, and then we had kind of a little backyard thing that had a lot of really grungy materials in it. And I decided that we're just gonna shoot there. It's gonna be awesome. We're gonna get it over with. I think I shot somebody else in the morning. It might have been Kelly Eden, I'm not sure, but I was really tired at that point. And the idea of trying to find a place in Venice Boardwalk and set up and film, and then having to deal with the photo police, which you always have to put up with in LA, that just seemed like a nightmare to me. So I'm really pleased with how this set turned out. I'm not so sure the model liked it. You know, I've never gotten any feedback from her. I think it looks awesome, but I recognize that it also is very skeletal looking, and it's not very attractive, and there's a lot of models I've shot with who, that's probably their priority, is that they look good in the photo as opposed to if the photo is interesting. So I don't know. I still love this series, and I'm sharing it with you today. This is me and Annie Montgomery with Laura Buenrostro and Brittany Moody.
Today I'm presenting a set that is not models. These are people that I photographed in a country called Macedonia. And Macedonia is where my wife is from. So we went there in 2014. It was, I mean, we've been married since 2001, but it takes a lot of money to get to Macedonia, especially when you have 4 people. So that's how long it took, 2014. And when we went there, we stayed in an apartment all our own. My kids were pretty young at that point. Currently, they're 9 and 10, so they would have been something like 6 and 7 at the time. And they got to meet members of their family that maybe they'll never meet again. This is my wife's grandpa. We got to see a lot of really cool interiors stuff, because Macedonia is former Yugoslavia. So we went to a few cities. We stayed in Skopje, which is the capital and the largest city. And we also went to Ohrid, which is next to a lake. The lake is called Lake Ohrid, and it's kind of like beautiful, a lot of Byzantine structures there, very Mediterranean feel. And we went to a few other cities. Some of the people in these photographs are members of my wife's family, and a lot of these people are people we just met on the streets. This particular lady, actually, my wife knew her when she was a child. My wife came to America around age 16. So this woman has not seen Vesna, my wife, since that time in the mid-90s, but she still recognized her. And she was working in a ticket booth, and this is what the interior of the ticket booth is like. Exteriors of these ticket booths are kind of like big green porta potty things, and I saw a lot of structures and architectural stuff that had that feel of former Soviet bloc, former communist environment. So not super special architecture, actually very industrial, and a lot of the buildings look the same. They're big gray blocks. And to me, as a traveler, that's really cool. Of course, travel is like a huge source of inspiration. When you get used to your own environment, sometimes it's hard to be inspired by that. So one thing about Macedonia and other kind of third world countries I've been to, there aren't a lot of people walking around being tourists with cameras. So the same thing happened when I was in Mexico City. Like, I was the only person out there with a camera that wasn't a point and shoot or a phone. But at the same time, when you go places that don't have a lot of tourists taking pictures, the people are a little more generous with the way that they appear in photographs for you. So I felt really lucky that I think only once or twice did somebody say like, I don't want pictures, you know. And those kind of people were actually not Macedonians. They were artists who were traveling through Macedonia, and maybe they were up to some kind of illegal arts and didn't want their face out there on the internet. I'm not really sure. But anywho, I hope you guys enjoy my travels to Macedonia. I also made a zine of it called Go Macedonia. And I will tell you one thing that I do with my zines that are travel. I mix up the locations and the people, because I feel like it's all one thing. You get a real sense of the place and the people when you alternate photos of things that are inanimate objects and portraits of the people who live there. Guys, I want to thank you so much for taking this class on art photography basics. This is something that is kind of like an accumulation of everything I learned in art school. And of course, the best experience is you getting your camera, going out there, making some art, presenting it to the public, whether it's as a show or through social media or through some kind of printed material like a zine or a self-published book. And then, of course, having the passage of time where you're able to actually reflect on what you've made if you felt it was of the quality you wanted it to be, or if you felt like you expressed the concept or the emotion that you tried to get across. It's always important to learn from mentors, whether they be real world or virtual. And so I hope that all of the experience I've been able to pass on through this course was of some value to you in your own artistic quest. You can give me some feedback at dbmillerphoto@gmail.com. Also, let me know what kind of classes you want to see in the future, because I want to make things for you guys. Thanks for watching. Check out the rest of my tutorials if you get the chance. Talk to you next time.